Connor O'Gara from Saturday Down South joining us, senior national columnist. You can follow him on the Twitter machine at CJ O'Gara. Connor, what's going on in your world, man? How are you?
Realize that I'm not in the same sort of world that you are right now, where you just pretty much have the premier athletics program in college sports. But I think I'm doing well here. I'm just trying to process the fact that you led my intro. You had my intro with like several Bobby Knight quotes in there, which makes me very conflicted as an Indiana grad who has some, let's just say, mixed feelings about Bobby Knight and the whole the whole fallout's one thing, but still haven't really gotten over the quote of all of us learn to write in second grade. Most of us go on to do greater things. I could also say that I actually learned how to play basketball when I was 3 years old, and I went on to bigger and better things. But whatever, I'm just going to let that sit there.
We didn't plan it that. We didn't plan it that way.
We did not. It was last. And I went to Indiana for a couple of years while Knight was still the coach. In fact, Neil Reed. You remember the name Neil Reed? He was in my class. We were in the same class, man. I mean, he was my favorite player. And Neil Reed eventually became, the end of the Bob Knight era at Indiana.
Neil Reed was the guy that was accused of the choking, right?
Well, it was Knight that was accused of choking.
Yes, okay. Just make sure I got the names right. Okay.
See where we ended up going with that, Connor? You didn't even want to talk about Bob Knight. And I was going to let you know, we even brought it up last week. It was the 35th anniversary of the chair being thrown.
Goodness gracious. Shout out to Robert Abbott, who directed that 30 for 30, who did such a tremendous job with it. It's so good. If you haven't seen it yet, this is a good time of year to kind of get tapped into all things college basketball. That's a nice hour and a half Saturday morning viewing. Recommend that a lot.
Well, and you joke about it a little bit. It's also some truth about the idea of we feel like we're at the nexus of college sports right now, or certainly, at least in the SEC, where you got the number one baseball team in the country. I know it's 2 weeks in. The two basketball teams, men's and women's teams, are playing lights out right now. And it's just really interesting to see how in the SEC, it's basically now, Connor, come down to Alabama and Arkansas and everybody else.
I'd like to think that Hunter Yurachek sat on his back porch on, I don't know, maybe Sunday night, last night, and had himself a nice bourbon and thought about, wow, what have I done? Because this is darn impressive. I mean, you're right. And I saw the Peter Burns tweet where you kind of go down the list and you look at, Hoops winning 9 straight, number one team in the country in baseball, women's basketball winning 5th in a row. Oh, by the way, you win the track, men's and women's indoor title, and then softball's won 10 in a row. It's that doesn't happen by accident, and this feels like a good reminder that athletic directors have so much pressure on them to get these hires right. And it feels like Hunter Yurachek has gotten some big-time hires right. Now, talking about Pittman and Musselman, of course, I think that people looked at those situations and thought, man, they're entering very different sort of, they're not necessarily in the same sort of standing. Everybody knows what Sam Pittman had to inherit, but you can't help but feel encouraged right now if you're an Arkansas fan. If you're a program that has to go through major change in your two biggest revenue sports, man, you just hope that your athletic director can get it right with both of them. Rarely does that happen, but it kind of feels like we can already safely say that. Now it's more about, hey, when are those extensions going to come?
It's just a matter of time. Connor O'Gara joining us here on Halftime. Connor, you mentioned football with Sam Pittman, one of the few teams that's not ranked at the University of Arkansas, but you tend to think that it's trending in the right direction here in the next few years. And I loved your piece you had on Saturday Down South when you were talking about SEC championship games. When is the next first-time winner? And of those teams, you had Arkansas at 4th on your list. And we'll kind of play with this for a second, but do you think Sam Pittman is the guy to get Arkansas back to the SEC championship game and maybe try to win the thing eventually?
So here's what I looked at with Arkansas, and I think this is something, and this is well documented, but if you're going to win a conference title, you have to look at the biggest possible hurdles standing in the way. I have been saying for years that I think we sort of bypassed Texas A&M's entry into the SEC as a potential hurdle for Arkansas to overcome. I think from a recruiting standpoint, what they do in the state of Texas, it just changes what Arkansas is from an identity standpoint. Now, you bring someone like Sam Pittman who recruits nationally, and recruits 5-star talent across the Southeast, that sort of changes what your hurdle looks like. So that's why I gave Arkansas a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt in that department and put them higher up than, let's say, a team like, Mississippi State, for example. Like Mississippi State has had one winning season in the SEC in the 21st century. It's hard to go to those lengths to say, oh, yeah, you're definitely knocking on the door of an SEC title when, we're talking about someone who has that working against them. And then the other hurdle of, oh, Mike Leach has never won a conference title during 2 decades as a Power 5 head coach. So that's something that we should probably factor into this. With Sam Pittman, yes, there is a little bit of this unknown of we don't know what the ceiling fully looks like yet. All we know is what this year one looked like when the deck was totally stacked against him, and it surpassed our wildest expectations, I think. And you could look at that season and say it should have been 4-6. So that's why I say that Arkansas is probably more so in the middle, still definitely behind a team like Mizzou, who, in my opinion, doesn't get enough credit for being there twice in consecutive years, during this decade of dominance that Saban has had, and even at a time when, Georgia was at least pretty good at one point during that stretch. So I think that's what you have to factor into consideration. And then a program like Ole Miss, who, again, we haven't seen the ceiling yet with Lane Kiffin, and that's kind of the big what if, whereas there are other programs where I feel like we know a little bit more about who they are.
But it almost seems to me, too, Connor, that with the occasional year of LSU and Coach Orgeron making it to the SEC championship game, until Nick Saban retires, I think it's Alabama's division to lose, right?
Yeah, but the weird thing about the West is that, it seems like as much as Alabama has dominated the division, it feels like, and this is so much easier said than done, if you beat Alabama, it's almost like, okay, your subsequent SEC championship is just going to follow. If you get over that hurdle. Now, there have been exceptions to that, Ole Miss being an exception to that back in 2015, of course. And, I think that you could look at some of the things that have played out over the course of the last decade and say, man, how are you ever going to get over that hurdle? But it has happened, right? I mean, it has happened. I think that Saban staying at Alabama is obviously the biggest hurdle standing in the way of every single SEC West team. That even includes Texas A&M, who, spoiler alert, I put at number 1 on the list, because when you recruit top 7 classes nationally year after year, you have now the talent to be able to rise to that level. There has not been a team worse than number 5 in terms of talent composite rankings that 24/7 Sports does that has won the SEC during this stretch that they've been doing those since 2015. So I think that has to be factored into consideration. But, I think that there are a lot of different things that go into this. But Arkansas is sitting there right now wondering what the ceiling is going to look like, and that's a much better place to be than some of these other programs.
Staying in the SEC, but outside of the Arkansas footprint, Eric Gilbert, the former LSU tight end, was a Florida commit and then changed his mind again. So what's going on here with Eric Gilbert? Because, the guy can't make up his mind where he wants to play. And, Connor, I think to me, does this hurt his value at all, just kind of bouncing around? Or was it just not the right fit at Florida? Like, what avenue should I be going down? Is this more of an Eric Gilbert issue or a Florida issue?
It's from what I've heard, and, I don't want to say anything definitive because everything that we've heard suggests that there are some personal issues going on there. There's been rumors and reports of potential academic hurdles to get through that Florida is still apparently trying to get through from their end. And that kind of spoke to some of the fallout with the way that things happen at LSU. Again, I don't know that definitively, but it would at least make sense with the way that things have played out, because if you're a 5-star tight end who burst onto the scene and has a lot of success in year one, you usually don't opt out and then transfer. And then, the Florida stuff, you have to look into his announcement, not that he was going to Florida, but that the announcement that came out yesterday that he wasn't going to be going to Florida after all. He said that he wasn't going to announce his next college destination until he enrolls over the summer, which leads you to believe, okay, he wants this to be all said and done. And he doesn't want there to have to be anything that he personally has to work through in order to make sure that something has happened. Now, there hasn't been like some massive coaching change or something like that, since the time that he committed there. So one would tend to think that this has been something that's on his end, but there's going to be teams lining up to get him. To answer your question about whether or not this hurts his value, I don't think it really does. I think there are teams that are going to be leery of him, but he's the highest rated tight end recruit of all time. And he did something that in year one as a former 5-star recruit, was super impressive. I mean, if you look at all the 5-star recruits in the 24/7 Sports era, you could argue that Zach Miller was the only 5-star tight end who had a better true freshman season than what Eric Gilbert did. I mean, this guy is incredibly talented, and any team would be lucky to have him. But there are things that are going to have to be sorted out, and it appears that this roller coaster is just getting started right now.
Let me end where we started here, Connor. Does Archie Miller deserve another year with your beloved Hoosiers? What is this, the 4th year? They're no better than they were.
I'm not an Archie guy. I'm just not. And I also acknowledge at the same time, and Arkansas fans know about this all too well, when that buyout is in the 8 figures, man, it makes you think long and hard about the future, because that's where it's at right now. And if they wait another year, I think it drops to something like $3.5 million, which seems a whole lot more manageable. But then there's other stuff about how does that impact recruiting, if he's essentially a lame duck coach, and that's really difficult to work through. Man, I think if it really depends on how it ends, but he's got a new boss, he's got a new athletic director there, and I think that if he finishes with, the losing streak, if they ride out this current losing streak, it's going to be hard to justify not paying that buyout. I look at programs across the country, and even just in the Big Ten, Chris Holtman and Juwan Howard, what they've done, and Arkansas, what they've done with coaches that are, year 1, year 2, and meanwhile at Indiana, it just has not worked, and it's not working. And that's the consensus that seems to be forming for so many of these programs, and it's hard to look at that situation and not think that there's a better option somewhere else.
You know what it's going to be hard for Hoosiers to look at? The NCAA basketball tournament being played in their state. Some of those games at Bloomington's Assembly Hall, and their Hoosiers are not a part of any of it.
Horrible optics to have your biggest recruiting pitch to be in 49 states. It's just basketball. And then, that doesn't fly when you're having the NCAA tournament and you're in year 4 with a head coach and you still can't get there.
Connor, appreciate you, man.
Thanks, Connor.
Hoosiers will get back there sometime. At some time. We'll see. We'll talk with Connor next week a little more about football. I kind of think like Indiana basketball is the Texas football of basketball, the Tennessee football of basketball, the former national championship winning program, legendary with coaches that you just can't stop talking about, and then they have not done crap for like 10 or 15 years in some cases. And I don't really care anymore about Indiana basketball. I was a fan of theirs for like 6 years, paid tuition there for 2 years, and now it's all just hazy memories-ish. How much of that I remember. 877-377-6963. As we get to the end of the first hour on halftime. And we'll get into the women's basketball team that plays Thursday night against Ole Miss. That is going to be a chippy one. These teams don't like each other.